I'm a female, currently 23, and I just started college and also live with my mom in New York. It was also around the time I had just dumped my abusive ex-boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive. I work on the other side of the city, and I'd oftentimes have to take public transportation to get there. Owning a car in the city was pointless, and I'd mostly take the subway to get to and from work. Say whatever you want, the subway was reliable and much more affordable. The problem was that I couldn't work late nights as I have a 7 a.m. class and my mother was strict about me being out late. It was stupid as I'm a grown adult, but knew she was just trying to be a mom. Up until recently, my managers, being the jerks that they were, knowing my situation, gave me a full week of closing shifts. I was pissed to say the least, but bit my lip and went with it. One night, during the closing week, I had just finished closing the store and walked out to the bus stop to wait for the bus. When I get to the stop, I notice a man I had never seen before sitting by himself. The bus stop was smaller than most, meaning that it didn't have much room for seating. With no other choice, I sit down near him while still keeping my distance just in case. I'd say right off the bat, this guy looked as if he were up to no good. Now, I'm not trying to judge based on appearance, but I could just tell by the vibe he gave off. All the while, he then started to look at me in a very bizarre way, almost staring. I give him a friendly smile to be polite, and he then introduced himself as Chad. I tell him it was nice to meet him and said my name as well. Yeah, big mistake. He then began to ask me random questions about myself, which I didn't mind seeing as he was the only one to talk to. We make small talk and eventually the bus arrives and I hop on with him following behind. I tried my best to sit far away from him as possible, but he followed me and sat down right next to me. Long story short, we continue our conversation when his normal and innocent questions started to become more personal. He started asking me things that I didn't feel comfortable answering. What was my type in men, if I had a boyfriend, etc. I told him I did have a boyfriend as a way of getting out of the conversation, which seemed to work. But whenever I gave him hints to stop talking to me, he'd always find something else to talk about or ask me sensitive questions. I uncomfortably chuckled to myself and took out my phone and texted my mom to meet me at my stop. I was on the seat closest to the aisle and kind of tilted away so he wouldn't know I was texting about him. After a few more minutes of him babbling on about some stuff, I take out my phone and pretended I was on a call. That seemed to faze him, and soon after my stop had come where my mom was in her car waiting outside. As I get up, he then gets up as well and inappropriately slaps my behind while giving me a chilling grin. I'd say I got off that bus within a matter of seconds before he started to follow. I hop into my mom's car and tell her to just go. My mom steps on it and we drive all the way home, making sure we weren't being followed. All the while, my mom is asking questions, making sure I was okay. We get home and I text my boss that I couldn't work late nights anymore, explaining my situation. A few weeks go by and I didn't end up seeing him for a while until I came home one day. I had come home to my mom's house from class, to her sitting at the kitchen table. Why my dad isn't in the picture is another story, but she sits me down and shows me a picture on her phone. At first I didn't know what it was, but then I realized it was a license plate number. Our plates. She had told me that she had received this photo from an unknown number with no context. We weren't sure who took the photo, but I believed that the guy at the bus stop had something to do with it. Two things like that don't happen so close together without them being linked somehow. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can understand. I'm 35 years old, and my wife and I had moved to a new house in Houston, Texas, along with our 8-year-old daughter. It was a pretty decent-sized house with 5 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms. I know, it's a bit big for a family of 3, but we come from a family with money and liked bigger homes. The first month of living there went pretty well with friendly neighbors and a quiet community. One day I had been riding my bike on my day off, enjoying the sun when another biker catches up and rides with me. He wore black sweatpants, a white t-shirt along with a red flannel and looked to be around 17 or 18. He introduced himself as Steve and welcomed me to the neighborhood. For the first few days he seemed like a decent kid, until one day he started asking me random questions. He would babble on about some random nonsense and always wanted to know about my time in Vietnam. Being ex-military, I learned to keep my cool, but gave him the hint to stop. Most of the time he'd begin to stop, but as time progressed, he'd always bring up the same topics. One of the topics that really set me off was when he talked about my 8-year-old daughter, telling me how cute she was, how he wished he had a sister like her, etc. Sometimes I'd see him looking over our fence while she played in the backyard and would always ask her questions. One day, he had called our house asking to speak to her, and it was at that point where he had crossed the line. I marched over to his house and knocked on his door, where I was greeted by an older couple who I assumed was his parents. I directly explained my concern to them as they didn't speak English and made it clear that I better not ever see him again. They seemed to get my message, and a few weeks later they had moved away. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but I was not going to stick around to find out. This happened to me about 8 years ago when I was living in New York City. I remember this just briefly, so I apologize for the shortness of the story. My name is Danny, and I was around 25 when this took place. I had recently gotten a job at the now famous M&M store in Times Square, and it's one of the funnest yet rewarding jobs I've had. My apartment building is on the other side of the city, so I had to take the subway to and from work. One night, I had just gotten off work and went down into the subway station to go home after a long night. While on the subway, I was listening to my music, minding my business, when I received a text from an unknown number telling me that they could see me. I typed back asking who they were and if they were on the train, to which they then responded with a yes. I look around the train, trying to look for anyone who could be staring at me. It was easier said than done, as there were about 70 plus people on their phones and I didn't know who it was. Not knowing what to do, I decided to be ballsy and play around by asking random questions that I was sure would catch him off guard. Soon after, my attempts at bombarding him with questions were useless, as he then typed my full name. At this point, I figured that maybe it was one of my friends coincidentally on the train with me. But the only problem was that I only had 3 close friends at the time, and all of them were pretty mature. I stood up and grabbed onto the pole to try and get a better view as to who it might have been. However, there was still nobody I could have suspected it to be, and sat down to just get to my stop. My stop eventually comes and I get off when my phone goes off once again. It was the same unknown number, and when I opened it, my heart dropped. It was a photo of my house. I reported the number to the police, but nothing ever became of it, and I ended up staying at a friend's house.